I mean, I feel I'm not a particularly religious person, but I feel like a preacher when it comes to how great an alcohol-free life can be. And I want to tell everyone about it. And I don't want to be that guy. And I don't want to walk into a room in a bar and tell everyone to stop drinking. And I don't think everyone needs to stop drinking. But for anyone who's interested, it's been such a positive change for me. And I was one of those persons that thought life without alcohol is going to be dull and boring and gray. And I was completely wrong. And I want to tell people about that.
Welcome to the Sober Edge podcast, inspiration for alcohol-free living. I'm your host, Terry Patterson, functional nutritionist and This Naked Mind senior coach. The Sober Edge is a place to explore the infinite possibilities on the other side of drinking. In a culture soaked in booze, discover the wonder and joy of taking a different path. Meet real people living lives of purpose and passion. Learn the truth behind the alcohol myths and get ready to be motivated, inspired, and astounded by what is possible with the Sober Edge. Welcome to the podcast. You are listening to the Sober Edge, episode 128. All right, well, it's Terry here, and today I want to introduce my guest, Todd Kinney, and share a little bit about his bio. Todd is an attorney who lives in Omaha, Nebraska with his wife, 4 kids, and 2 wiener dogs. In his free time, he enjoys traveling, golf, hanging out with his family when they let him, and spending an unhealthy amount of time and money supporting the Iowa Hawkeyes. He quit drinking in 2019 and considers it the best thing he's ever done for himself and his family. So in the episode today, you're going to hear Todd talk about his book, and how he navigated his journey through considering drinking, not drinking, and his relationship with his children, his wife, what his children think of his book. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the impact he had on the women who were in the audience when Todd spoke at the Sober in the City event. So I think you're going to really enjoy the podcast episode. Also, I wanted to share that I have a wait list that I'm opening up with this episode today for my middle self course program. I'm not sure exactly what it looks like yet. So I want to invite you to come on the wait list and travel with me on this journey about creating this beautiful thing called midlife. I've been doing a deep dive into how I want to spend my next 30 or 40 years, and I want to invite you to come along with me. So if you're interested in learning more, there is a link in the show notes and also in the episode page for this podcast and in my newsletter. Please join me and sign up, and I'll be getting you more information very soon. All right, well, let's head on into the episode and enjoy this time with Terry and Todd. Well, hey, everyone, it's Terry back with another edition of the Sober Edge podcast. And I'm excited to introduce you to a new friend that I met recently. This is Todd Kinney. And Todd Kinney has written a book called I Didn't Believe It Either. And it's really about a dad's journey to discovering alcohol freedom. So welcome to the podcast, Todd.
Thank you, Terry. It's nice to be here.
Yes, so we met in Tampa, Florida, when we were both at the Sober in the City event. You were a speaker. And I have to say, if you haven't heard this already, there's been so much positive feedback from the talk that you gave. And I think what really resonated is there was, 100 women at the event and 2 men. And you really had the opportunity to share a bit of a male perspective with us. And do you find that that is kind of the way your speaking engagements are going?
Yes. Yes. It's funny because I got a lot of questions at Sober in the City from women there about how do we get more men involved in things like this and in this space. And that's been on my mind a lot since Sober in the City. Because like you said, there were two of us there. But it was really a neat event. And I went home just very fulfilled from it. And I thought, we got to get more males involved in this thing, because it's just it's really neat to be in a room full of people who have made the same decision, and in the same room as people who have made that decision and had such a positive impact on their lives. So yes, it's usually it's been this way since I quit drinking 4.5 years ago, and the space has always been female, predominantly female dominated. And I've told people, I may have mentioned this in Tampa when I first started talking about this, I actually felt more comfortable talking to women, because I just felt at less risk of being judged, and I had all this stuff wrapped up in in masculinity and drinking, and what does this even mean if I give up? What does this mean for me as a guy if I give up drinking? Am I even a real guy anymore? So it was comforting for me at first, and I've always been grateful for that, for the reception that you get from women in this sober space. But yes, I would love to see more men uh getting involved. I think we just need to pull them along a little more.
Yes, and one of the things I appreciated, with the Sober in the City event is just this ability to celebrate this life that we're living. And I know that part of your story was the question that so many of my listeners have is, how will I have fun? How will I show up? What will my social life look like? What will my personal life look like if I decide to really do this thing and stop drinking? So tell us a little bit about that journey for you and what you discovered.
Yeah, so I had all those exact questions running through my head. And frankly, they kept me stuck, and they kept me from really seriously considering giving up quitting for a long time, because they're really scary, life altering questions, or they feel like it, and not in a good way. They feel like it when you're at the beginning of this whole process and you're thinking about giving it up. Those things seem like really overwhelming hurdles that you don't know how to get over. And like I said, I had every one of those. I have a chapter in the book called "None of the Bad Things Happened," and it's my list of like all those things that I thought were going to happen. And I talk about, here's what I believed before I quit, and here's what I found out since I quit. And I can tell anyone listening, genuinely, none of the bad things I thought were going to happen happened, but I was very certain that they were going to.
Mhm.
Um, and it's funny. I don't know. I've thought a lot about how do you convince someone who's thinking about giving it up that all those things are not as bad as they feel in the moment. And all I can do is kind of tell them my experience, but I also remember very clearly how heavy those feelings are. And I'm not sure if someone would have came to me and said, "Hey, listen, don't worry about that stuff. It's not gonna, your social life's gonna be fine." I probably would have been like, "You don't know that. It's at the time you really can't imagine a social life that doesn't involve alcohol. I mean,
Mhm.
at least a fun one. It's really difficult to imagine." Um, what I've discovered is all those things I was worried about, like vacations and work travel, and just socializing with friends and neighbors, and football games, and sports trips with my kids, all those things that you can't, when you're at the beginning, you literally can't imagine doing without alcohol. What I found was I enjoy them much, much more now, all of those things without alcohol, more than I did with alcohol. You couldn't pay me to go back to the drinking version of any of those things.
Yeah.
And I don't know how, you can't just magically transport yourself to that place. Um, that took months for me to get to that place. It took me doing those things. And I didn't love it right off the bat. My first um, trip I did. I remember my first work trip that I didn't drink. I loved how I felt when I got on that plane to come home, but I'm not gonna lie and say I enjoyed every minute of it while I was doing it. It was a little bit of, white knuckling. It was a little bit like forming it was new patterns. And so it's not great right off the bat, but once every time you do one of those things once, it gets a little bit easier. And then the next time is a little easier, and the next time, and then before you know it, you're enjoying those experiences more without alcohol, and you kind of forget that you even did them with alcohol.
Yeah.
Um, I have I have a few trips, a few kind of bucket list trips that didn't even weren't even bad from an alcohol standpoint, but that I wish so badly I could go back and do as a non-drinker.
Yeah, yeah, and I love that you said that, Todd. Thank you for that because it's such a weird place when we're standing on one side. It's almost like a trust fall. Like you
Yeah.
have to allow yourself to just sort of do the leap or the fall and trust that you're going to figure it out as you go. And when we think back, I think those of us on this side of alcohol, we'll talk about our friend Peggy Cooney with that book. Um, I think we really see that that's all of life. All of life is a trust fall. We get married, we don't know if it's going to work out. People tell us it's going to be great. Some people tell us it's going to be awful. We look at this person and wonder what the heck we're doing. We're going to change our identity from being single to being married. We're going to change our identity from not having children to being a parent. All of life is really like that. And yet, with alcohol, it feels so impossible. And I think, for me, I certainly was exactly in that place. I didn't know what my life would look like, but I did recognize that I was miserable where I was. And I literally remember telling myself, well, I'm miserable now. I'll probably be miserable not drinking, but maybe not.
But
Uh,
at least
you
you'll
know,
be miserable without a hangover. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Exactly. And you share, I think, one of the things that's really powerful about your book is this idea of being the dad you want to be. So, what has changed for you as a parent in these last 4 years?
Oh man, I could talk all day about this because it's been one of the best blessings I've received from all of this, and so many and like sobriety is like this so many ways, so many unexpected blessings that I didn't see coming, that I couldn't understand, that I couldn't conceptualize, and the parenting stuff is at the top of that list. And I think part of it is for me that was such a big motivator for me. I tell people I didn't have a flame out spectacular rock bottom, but I had a lot of little nudges along the way that got me to that point where I decided to quit. And a lot of the nudges started the more forceful nudges start involve my kids. They were getting to the age where they were at an age. My oldest was 14, and the second was 13. And then we had let's see, he would have been 11. Um, our third would have been 11 when I quit. And so they were at the point where, they knew when I had had too much to drink. They knew when adults were drinking in excess, which happened a lot in our social circle with us and other people. So they were figuring it out, and those things started to bother me. I hated the fact that my kids saw me a few times really drunk, and there were a couple times where I would come home and I had conversations with them that I did not remember the next day. I hated that. I hated how that made me feel. It just made me want to crawl out of my skin, and it just made me feel like I was the worst dad on the planet. And I reached a point where I knew, or I finally admitted to myself that no matter, even though I hated that feeling so much, I knew with 100% certainty it was going to happen again. I didn't know when. It might be a month, it might be 6 months. Maybe it was only one or two more times, but it was going to happen again. And so I asked myself, why? why are you doing this activity that you know is going to make you feel like that at some point? Why that's insane. Um, and once I admitted to myself, you know it's going to happen again, and you know how much you hate it, then why don't you do something about it? Well, the once I admitted that to myself, the only thing left to do was to give it up. But so they were a big motivator for me. And I know, everyone says you got to do it for yourself, and that's true. Um, but in the beginning, they were a big reason why I did it. And the blessing has come in the form of, and this is true with so much of quitting. There are so many things that I didn't realize when I was in the middle of drinking, how my alcohol use was affecting me and my family life and people around me. Just completely oblivious to it. And one of the things that I didn't realize until after I quit was that, when you drink like I did, and I didn't drink every day, but I drank every weekend, and I drank socially, and I looked forward to my occasions where I was going to drink, and I took those occasions seriously. Um, but when you get in that mode, you check out as a dad, as a parent, and you become not available to your kids, or less available, but not as available as you should be and as we want to be. And I had no awareness that this was happening when I was drinking, even though it happened almost every Friday, Saturday night, and other times, on vacations. Um, they we would do a lot of I would do a lot of checking out on vacation. One, because it's vacation. Two, there's more drinking than normal on vacation, and you're just not available to your kids like we want to be. And my kids were one was they were early teenagers. One was younger than that, or two were younger than that, but they were two of them were teenagers. And I think sometimes as parents, we think as they get older, and they start to want to hang out with their friends more, and they stop wanting to hang out with us as much, and they stop listening to us, and they stop caring about what we think, that they don't need us as much. And I think that's it's the opposite. They need us more when they get to those ages. Those are tough ages for kids.
Hmm.
They're going through a lot. And even though they, storm off to their room a lot when we try to talk to them, and may not want to spend as much time with us, it's more important than ever that we're there for them during those years. And removing alcohol from my life has I made me more available to them. And I mean, that's good in and of itself, but the peace and the calm that comes with that is just priceless and hard to describe. Um, I mean, how many nights, Friday and Saturday nights, something could have happened with my one of my kids, and I wouldn't have been available as a dad or as a partner to my wife to deal with it. I mean, luckily we dodged that bullet for the most part, but it could have easily happened. And the sense of calm and confidence I have now, knowing that that's never going to happen. And we all know with teenagers, shit's gonna hit the fan, and it's usually gonna be at 1 in the morning, um, which sometimes on a weekend, which were all prime times when I was not going to be available. That's never going to happen. I'm always going to be available, and I can't describe how good that feels.
Yeah,
And
and what I love about this, Todd, is this idea that, what you're highlighting here is bad things can happen. And also, what I think is so powerful here is that things are happening. We forget
yeah,
that things are happening all along the way with our kids. There's this beautiful work that the Gottmans do in marriage counseling, and they talk about this bid for affection. And I think we miss this opportunity with our partners. We miss this opportunity with our children sometimes, particularly when we're drinking. And so they talk about this moment where your partner or your child might engage. And if we are not aware to respond to that bid for affection, we miss that connection. And this is going on every day. And the days that we're drinking and we're, like you said, we're just not even recognizing there's a veil that we don't see through. We're not recognizing these missed moments. And it's not to put people in this place of feeling so much regret and sorrow. Like, we do the best we can. And when we are drinking and not recognizing that there's an impact, we just drink. And that's the way the world works. And so I love this idea of just now being emotionally available, physically available, mentally available. And you're right, our children need this so much as they're going through those pivotal years. So, what do they think about your book?
I've asked them that recently because none of them have read it cover to cover. They've each read bits and pieces. Um, they enjoy the stories I tell about me making very poor decisions as a teenager myself. I can tell
Of
you that.
course.
Uh, they they know the skeletons in my closet now. They haven't used that against me yet, but I'm sure that's coming. Um, they I think they're proud of me for writing it. I think they think it's neat. I've been really fascinated by their friends' interest in the book. One of my oldest friends just asked for a copy last night, and when I finally got this book out, I decided, you know what, any kid, any friend of my kids who wants to read this book, I'm gonna give it to them for free. So I happily give away books to any of their friends who want it. But they're I've been fascinated by how interested their friends have been in the process of writing it, and my sobriety in general. And since it came out, I've given quite a few out to their friends. I don't know how many of them have actually read it, but um it's interesting to me that they're so drawn to it. But I think that's neat. um
I think so
so yeah.
too. Yeah. I can imagine that as a kid, they're saying, I'm so glad my dad didn't write this, but I want to know about this subject, right? And I
Yeah.
want to have a safe place to explore these questions that are coming up for me. And, I think as humans, we all have a little bit of that voyeuristic tendency to want to see inside someone else's
Yeah.
life. And your book has been very transparent. And so they're getting a glimpse of what it means to grow up in a place that they might find themselves at, where they're exploring and experimenting and breaking rules, and then to see like what unfolds. So, what a gift.
I think it's good for kids, I think, to know that their parents or other adults struggle with things. And I think it's really good for them to see that you found a way to overcome whatever that struggle is. And that can be alcohol or anything really. But I think that's good for kids. And one of the things I love most about not just the book, but the fact that I gave up drinking was, if nothing else, it shows my kids and their friends that there is another way, if you want it. Because I didn't. I mean, even until up until I was 44 years old when I quit. I didn't really know there was another way. I just thought, that's how life is. Life involves alcohol, and I thought for the longest time, the only people that don't drink are the ones that like get dragged away by the police and go to jail and have to go to treatment, or, put their car in a ditch and lose their family and hit a spectacular rock bottom and then go to treatment. That was my, you know, conceptual idea of who needed to quit drinking. And so I think it's good just to show them, look, you can decide to quit or never start, just because you think it might be a better decision and for you. And it might make you feel better, and it might make you like yourself more. I think it's good to show them that that's an option.
I agree. I agree. So I want to talk a little bit about what really resonated with the women in Tampa, and that was talk that you gave around your relationship with your wife, and you asked a really important question. The very first thing you asked us was, how many of you in this room, and there was probably 70 or more women in the room, how many of you have a spouse that still drinks? So can you start there? What was our response?
It looked like 75% of the room raised their hand. I was surprised that it was that many, but it was a lot.
Yeah.
Which I was kind of relieved because I thought, oh well, good, maybe maybe this topic has a chance of resonating more. Um, but it was a lot, and I was a little nervous about talking about that chapter because as much as I've talked about my book, I have not really dug into that particular chapter very much. And I was trying to think of something that would resonate with the most people in the room. And so I decided to dive into it. And that was probably the hardest chapter of the book to write because I had to dig into some stuff that I had never dug into, didn't really want to, wasn't that excited about diving into some of the issues around that because I didn't know what I was going to find. I didn't know what the results were going to be. It involved some questioning of my marriage that I had never gone through in about 20 years of being married up to that point. So it was scary to do that, but one thing this decision to quit, well, my whole journey with alcohol taught me was this stuff that like an issue, if an issue is big enough, it doesn't go away on its own.
Yeah.
You know, I tried to push down the alcohol issues for a long time, and I would push them down for periods of time, but it always comes back. Um, in some way, shape, or form, it comes back. And I never really had that realization until I decided to quit drinking. And so when I had these issues with my marriage pop up, I was like, oh shit, these are coming back. These are not going away on their own.
Yeah.
I can't drink, Adam. I can't numb my what I'm feeling with alcohol anymore, and they're not going anywhere. And so I had this kind of panic of like, you got to figure this out. And I didn't know what figuring it out looked like. And so it was, the two main issues for me and my marriage, because my wife does still drink, and she doesn't drink like I did, thankfully. Otherwise, it would be a problem. But she doesn't, and she's got a totally different relationship with alcohol than I did. But I was having two main issues: connection and support. And as you know, those are two huge things when you give up alcohol. And I found I needed both of those. I needed a lot of both of those. And
Mhm.
in the beginning, I was looking strictly to Beth, my wife, for all the connection I needed and all the support I needed. And I didn't feel like I was getting much of either from her. And that was frustrating. And it was causing me to build up resentment. And meanwhile, I was doing all of this in my head and not talking to her about it. So big surprise, that doesn't help much. Um, but in hindsight, I was looking to her for connection that she never would have been able to give me anyway because she doesn't have the same relationship with alcohol I do, and she wasn't giving up alcohol.
Mm.
And so someone who doesn't have the same relationship with alcohol doesn't just they can understand to an extent what it's like to give it up, but there's some stuff they're just not going to get. I don't think, just because they just don't think about it in the same way. And
Yeah.
so it's just it was I was looking in the wrong place for some of that, and getting resentful that I wasn't getting it from the person closest to me. But I found it elsewhere. I found it in an online, sobriety support group called the Luckiest Club, which I leaned on heavily in my first couple months, and met some people there that I still am friends with today. In fact, that's where I met Peggy, and that's where I met Jeff, the one other guy at Sober in the City with me. So I met some great people there that I'm still friends with today. But it took me a while to kind of get comfortable that that was okay, that I was filling my connection need through those channels and not my wife. And really, our spouses can't be, we can't expect our spouses to fill our all of our emotional needs anyway. But it was that took some time to work through. And but we eventually did, and the support thing took some time to work through. Um, and it was just, it wasn't a magic, it didn't happen overnight. Um, but I think there was a lot of, I was going through a lot and keeping it to myself, and having these imaginary conversations with my wife in my head, and then getting a mad, I get mad at her for saying these imaginary things in my head. Um, Not productive, but I was doing this a lot, and I was also doing a lot of assuming of how she felt and how she would respond to certain things. And I was not always right about in those assumptions. But we're with someone for 20 years. We think we know them well, and we do know them pretty well, but we think we know exactly how they're feeling about something or how they might react to something. And sometimes we don't know as much as well as we think we do.
Yeah, and
And
I'm so glad that you wrote this chapter in your book because I think this conversation can be a stumbling block for so many of us on this journey. And my own story was I stopped drinking, my husband stopped drinking. It was 2 years later. And in those 2 years, there was a lot of challenges for certainly in that first year. In fact, it was my husband who came to me and said, "I think we need to go to marriage counseling." And it was because I think what you're talking about is we have these relationships, and my husband and I, we've now been married 41 years. So, and when I stopped drinking 8 years ago, we were a little further along than you. And
yeah.
we had established these patterns, but what I didn't realize was that drinking had also become part of the way that we communicated, part of the way that we sort of stuffed things under the rug, things we walked away from, unresolved conflict. There was a lot
Hmm.
there with drinking. And what I've noticed with so many of my clients, who are mostly women, is that they take a step back from drinking and then they look up and they see their spouse and they think, oh shit, who is this person? What have I done? And often I see in the large groups that I used to coach in that, they'd be all these people would be on this journey together. So they'd start, and then be a whole year that we'd spend together with coaching in the path. And what you'd see is kind of this collective around 3 months alcohol free. Everybody would say, I'm getting a divorce. And then I'd be like, well, hold on a minute. Let's slow your roll because what's happening is you're recognizing the parts of your relationship that are unresolved.
Hmm.
And I think that that is a hard thing is that when we look up and we say, oh my gosh, there's a bunch of unresolved conflict. There's a bunch of thoughts I have in my head, as you're talking about. There's a bunch of conversations that I'm not actually having, and there's a bunch of assumptions, and things look different. And we really take off, I like to say we take off those rosé colored glasses and then we see things as they are. And it can be a tough place to land. And I think when what you are doing by bringing this conversation out is sharing that this is not your marriage is not necessarily broken, but it does need repair. I think that that happens. And certainly in the place where my husband and I were, we had spent a long time we would drink at our problems instead of talk
Hmm.
about our,
Hmm.
and that became a place that we really had to start working on communication. And I also had a lot of resentment that I was doing this and he was still drinking with no consequences, nothing happening. And I told myself that, and I told him, I'm fine with you doing you, but I wasn't. It was hard.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a whole new dynamic. And I underestimated that a little bit from Beth's perspective because I was so consumed with what I was doing because it was difficult for me. The physical part wasn't necessarily that difficult, but the mental part of giving up drinking was difficult for me. And so I was very consumed with that. And it was like, hey, look, I'm doing this. I'm doing all this hard stuff. Why am I not getting, more of a pat on the back? And and meanwhile, all the questions that I confronted about quitting drinking and what does this mean for social life and vacations and all that stuff, she's doing the same thing. Um, and having just as much trouble figuring that out as I was, but we weren't talking about it. We were each kind of going our own direction and thinking, well, she's not, I'm thinking she's not supportive, and she's thinking, well, he just changed the rules on us, and I don't know what that's going to look like. And meanwhile, I'm going here, she's going here, and we weren't communicating very much about it. And so we finally started communicating about it and had some very honest, hard conversations about what, to your, you made a really good point about, realizing what's out there once you take alcohol away and you're confronted with things that you haven't been confronted before. And I experienced that too. And eventually I had to say, look, this is what I need out of the relationship that I think I had always needed,
Mhm.
but I had never, we'd never had that conversation. And I didn't realize how much alcohol had gotten in the way of that over the years. But it had. Um, and those are all scary conversations to have, but they're also good conversations to have. And I found that those conversations that feel the scariest are usually the ones you need to have the most. And they're usually the ones that lead to the biggest, breakthroughs. And at the end, you're relieved and you're glad that you ended up having the conversations. But you take away the drinking, and a lot of those conversations are staring you in the face for the first time. And so that can be very daunting. And I remember I read or heard, I've heard this more than once, but I don't know. So I don't know where it's from, but I heard someone say, don't make any rash decisions in your first year after you quit drinking. And I've thought of that often. I think that's wonderful advice, because where you're at in month 3 is not necessarily where you're going to be at in month 6 or month 9 or month 12, even though in month 3, those feelings feel like they're going to be there forever. They're not, but it feels like it is. So I think that's very good advice.
Yeah, and my husband, he came to me and said, "I think we should get some counseling because you are angry all the time." And I was like, "No, I'm not." And I was like, "Oh, maybe there is a little anger." And, I think there's so many things coming at us in the beginning of this journey, and not to scare people away from taking the journey. They're good things. They're getting back in touch with our own values. They're getting back in touch with true emotions. We're
Hmm.
we're putting things out in the world and receiving things that are big, as life should be. Life is
Yeah.
big. And so, there's a lot happening, and it's okay to have big swings of emotions. And as you mentioned, Todd, I think this is so key, is find the support that you need, and don't expect that your spouse is going to be your one and only person. And then also talk about the type of support you're getting so that it's not a big secret. I should
Right.
say, this is my experience and one suggestion to consider. I don't want to give anyone directives, because some people do keep this secret from their spouse. I've worked with women who have said, "I went through an entire year and no one knows that I did this, counseling and this coaching and this working and this connection." And I think how fascinating it is, because one of the things that was such a gift to me was to stop hiding parts of myself. And
Mhm.
so I want to encourage people to consider being open about the level of support you need, the level of support you're getting, and wear it as a badge of honor, not as a badge of shame. But again, that's just me. How did you start to reveal to Beth, that you were a part of the Luckiest Club, that you were getting this type of support? How did that all play out in your marriage and your relationship?
So it's funny you asked that, because when I first, so the Luckiest Club was these sobriety support group meetings. started online by Laura McCowan right around when COVID hit. And so you could pop on your computer. They back then they had at least one meeting a day, probably more. I know they have several a day now, I think. But you could pop on, you could turn your camera on, you could leave it off. You could speak up if you wanted to, you could stay silent, you could do whatever you wanted to. And it was really nice because every time I got on, there were 175, 200 other people on the meeting who I just knew were out there in the world somewhere going through something similar that I was going through. And I literally, before, not that long before I decided to quit, I literally thought I was the only person on the planet who dealt with the issues with alcohol that I did. And so to see other people out there and that um, awareness that, oh my gosh, there's people everywhere struggling in the way that I'm struggling was so helpful to me. But when I first started going to these meetings, I hid it from my wife, which is crazy. But there was a day where she came down, we were working at home because of COVID, and I was sitting at the kitchen table on one of these meetings, and she came downstairs and I shut my computer. I was like, what is this about? What are you doing? And so I eventually told her about the Luckiest Club. I was connecting with a lot of people through the Luckiest Club. Most of them were women. That felt a little weird. I wasn't sure if I should be doing that.
Mhm.
I mean, I really liked the connection part, and I loved interacting with people who were who were nodding along when I would talk about, what I was going through, and I was doing the same when they would talk about what they were going through. Um, but it still felt a little weird. And so I told my wife one day, this was probably, I don't know, after maybe a month of going to these meetings. I said, listen, I have been attending these meetings almost every day. They're very helpful to me. I've been connecting with other people. Most of them are women, over this stuff. And I need to know that you're okay with that. And if you're not, we need to talk about it. But this has really been a helpful form of support for me. And she was fine with all of that. She still didn't get all of it, but she did understand my need to connect, which helped, which I was appreciative of. And she's always been good about that, since then. Because even now, a lot of the people who reach out to me and that I talk to on a regular basis or semi-regular basis are women. And so she's always been pretty good about that, which I've always appreciated. And it was a good lesson for me. And go to where you need to go to find your connection, especially something like this. That's so, I think I mentioned this in Tampa. Uh, People who have confronted their drinking issues and decided to quit, and then realized that there's a whole other way of living out there that we didn't even know about. There's a connection there that's just different from your normal everyday connection you have with a stranger you meet on the street. It's really hard to describe, but it's just different. I think it's a little stronger. It's like a secret language with that person. You have a sense for, even if your kind of background stories differ wildly, um, you still have a sense for where they've come from and how they're living now. And I think that's such a strong, neat connector, that's just different from anything else I've experienced.
Yeah, I agree. It's beautiful. And I sort of consider it like moving from small talk to big talk.
Hmm.
This beautiful idea that we want to go a little deeper and we have more invested in connection and relationships. At least I do on the other side of not drinking. So
Yeah.
that's been huge for me. So I wonder, so many of my listeners also are in this place that you and I are, where we are not drinking and we are enjoying our new life. And I think there's this beautiful place of liberation versus fixation. And so I don't, if people ask me
I like
sometimes,
that.
well, yeah, how much it would, I think it's really from Annie Grace, but I'll co-opt it and share it as well. But people sometimes will say, well, how much do you think about drinking? And I say, I don't think about drinking at all personally, but I'm also in this world day by day by day,
Yeah.
talking to people, having these conversations. And so I wonder for you, you're not a coach, but you're now an author and you're in this space. Where are you finding that you still need support around this journey, or you feel freedom and you're just exploring this journey because it feels good? What's happening for you now in this after alcohol place that you're at?
So that's a good question. I remember I went, let's see, it would have been a year ago, uh, this June. I went to see Laura McCowan talk after her second book came out,
Mm.
Push Off From Here. And she said something at that event that stuck with me. And someone asked, I think someone asked her a similar question to what you just asked, but it was a little more pointed. And I think it was along the lines of how much do you think about drinking today? And she said, I never think about drinking. And at the time and I mean, she's obviously farther down the road than I am. At the time I was like, man, really? That's interesting to me. Cause at that time I was like, I still think about it. Not in terms of, I wish I could have a drink, but just, I was aware that I don't drink anymore. And it was still kind of out there. And I'm much less, oh, I guess it's much less out there now than it was a year ago, June. And so I remember, I don't know, a couple of weeks ago, I thought back to that, to Laura's response, and I thought, oh, okay, it's ringing a little differently now than it did when I heard it. So I think I'm kind of like you. I don't, yeah, I never, I don't have thoughts of, oh boy, I wish I could drink, anymore, which is nice. Um, I do. There are times when shit's hitting the fan. I do always take a moment and think to myself, well, this situation really sucks, but it would suck a lot more if I was still drinking. And man, I'm really grateful that I'm not. And that always makes me feel a little better about the situation, even though it doesn't change the situation itself. But it reminds me that I'm just in a much better place and much more equipped to deal with whatever it is. And that just that in and of itself makes the situation a little better. So I'm kind of, yeah, I don't think about drinking anymore in terms of I want to drink. I do like to stay kind of in it because I don't want to forget about, and the book, I kind of have the book now, which is nice, but I don't want to forget about those months leading up to when I decided to quit. I don't want to forget about those first 6, 8 months and the challenges that I faced then. Um, because I think we can fall into a trap a little bit, getting the further you get out from it, of thinking, well, you know, and you run into someone who's tried to quit for 9 times, and they keep struggling and they keep having day ones, and sometimes you have this inclination to just say, listen, you just got to quit, you just got to do it. Like, if you really want to do it, you just got to do it. Well, we all know it's not that simple, otherwise nobody would have trouble quitting. So I have to remind myself sometimes, it's not easy. It can have a hold on someone that is hard for a rational mind to understand. But it is an absolute prison for some people. And so I don't want to forget that. And so I like staying close to, in this space for that reason too. But the other reason too is I think it's so important, and I have such a passion for this because it's been such a positive change in my life. I mean, I feel I'm not a particularly religious person, but I feel like a preacher when it comes to how great an alcohol-free life can be. And I want to tell everyone about it. And I don't want to be that guy. And I don't want to walk into a room in a bar and tell everyone to stop drinking. And I don't think everyone needs to stop drinking. But for anyone who's interested, it's been such a positive change for me. And I was one of those persons that thought life without alcohol is going to be dull and boring and gray. And I was completely wrong. And I want to tell people about that because there's so much out there. Um, and it's so much better if you're willing to take that leap. And I want to help get people there.
Yeah, yeah. Agreed, agreed. And I say preach, yeah. And you know what? I wanted to ask you that question in particular because I think that one of the fears for people is that I'm gonna have to go to meetings for the rest of my life. I'm gonna have
Yeah.
to do the work. It's gonna be hard work forever. And what you and I have experienced is it's not, it's a freedom. And any
Oh, such a
work
freedom.
we do around it is passion-based, sharing. It doesn't feel like work. Like when you came
No.
to Sober in the City and were speaking, I would imagine that it was wonderful. It was an elation to be able to share that. I mean, it certainly came off in your talk versus what we think about like oh, I'm going to be a slave to this. It's going to be a chain. I have to keep focusing on it for the rest of my life. And gosh, it's just that has not been my experience. And I love to highlight that for people.
Yes, freedom is the perfect word for it. And again, 4 years ago, if you would have mentioned freedom in this context, I would have been like, what are you talking about? Freedom. But that's exactly what it is. And it's hard to describe how good it feels.
It is. Yeah, right where we started the conversation, like we cannot it's hard to tell people. And we're not in the convincing business, but I think our life is hopefully we're living our lives in a way that is inspiring and aspirational for people who want to consider this change. So I have two questions for you. The first one is how did you come up with the title for the book?
Oh, good question. Because that took me a long time. And I went through, I'm not kidding, probably a dozen titles. Peggy helped me with some, the publisher helped with some, and I just couldn't land on something that I loved and that just hit right. It was something that was always a little off, or I'd think of one that I really liked, and then I'd find out it was the title of another book. And so, um, but I wanted something to convey kind of what we were just talking about, that this way of living is so above and beyond anything I imagined. Um, but I also wanted people to know, look, I was where you might be at right now. And if you would have told me all this stuff 4.5 years ago, that all this stuff was going to happen, I would have bet you a large sum of money that you were lying and that you were wrong. And I was wrong. And it's just blows my mind how wrong I was. And it blows my mind that this whole other way of living is out there that I didn't even understand not that long ago. And so I wanted something that conveyed like, look, I get it. You might be a little skeptical when you hear this stuff. I was too, but I did it. And I'm telling you, this is how it was for me. And it's awesome. And I can't, like you said, we're not in the convincing business. You're not, nobody can convince anyone to stop drinking. That's not how it works. But what we can do is tell them our experiences. And I just wanted something that conveyed to the reader, like, if you're skeptical, I get it. I was too. And let me tell you what I found.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. Yeah, it's a great title and it really does. And the cover of the book kind of pulling back the curtain like guess what's out there, this whole big beautiful life that
Yeah.
we've been closed off from by our own choice and
Yeah.
such an empowering powerful thing to step out on the other side. So, I love having this conversation. Thank you so much for sharing today. What's next for Todd?
I'm just going to keep putting the book out there. I love doing speaking events like I did at Sober in the City. I love connecting with people over this stuff. I want to just I want to keep doing all of those things.
Yes, well, good. I'm glad because we need more voices like yours in the world. We need that positive momentum around, wow, when I made this change, I became a better dad, a better husband, a better friend, all of those things. And it's just such a great reminder that we can make a hard choice, but we don't have to land in a hard place. We
Yeah.
actually have this beautiful opportunity to grow into the most authentic version of ourselves. And I want to thank you for showing up authentically today and for putting that book out there in the world. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me. I enjoyed it. And I love these conversations. So
Well, good.
thanks for
And we're
having me.
gonna we're gonna link to your book and more
All right.
information about you and how people can stay connected. We'll also link to the Luckiest Club since that was such a pivotal part of your journey. And I hope we'll catch up soon.
Me too. Thanks, Terry.
I want to thank you for tuning in to the Sober Edge podcast. This is a place for important conversations and a safe place to question everything you thought you knew about drinking. If you're looking for your sober edge, I want to invite you to connect with me at thesobernutritionist.com, where you can grab my free resource, Becoming More, a guide to loving your sober life. And I would be so grateful if you enjoyed this podcast, if you would leave a rating and review, as it will help more people find their sober edge.